The unseen heroes enduring the medieval winter. Tonight, we delve into the extraordinary tapestry of medieval peasant life, a saga woven with threads of raw courage and astonishing resilience. These were the unsung heroes of their age, men, women, and children who, against a relentless backdrop of biting cold and unforgiving elements, carved out an existence that defied the very odds of survival. From cunning makeshift insulation hacks to the intimate warmth of communal sleeping, their story is a testament to human grit, boundless ingenuity, and a steely determination that echoes through the centuries. So, as you settle in, perhaps by a modern hearth that banishes all thought of frost, take a moment to consider their plight and the remarkable spirit that saw them through. When the mind wanders to medieval times, it often conjures vivid images of chivalrous knights, opulent banquets, and boisterous village fairs. Yet for the vast majority, the humble peasants, winter painted a far grimmer picture. It wasn't a season of festive cheer, it was an annual merciless crucible, a brutal examination of endurance that returned with the grim regularity of a cruel teacher utterly devoid of second chances. Imagine for a moment, you inhabit a rudimentary hut, its walls a fragile weave of mud and sticks so porous that the mere sneeze of a bird outside might penetrate its meager defenses. Insulation was a whispered dream, windows non-existent save for a small, animal skin stuffed aperture, and the concept of a thermostat war with siblings was a futuristic absurdity. Inside, the air temperature politely lingered just a few degrees above the unforgiving chill of the outdoors. If frost hardened the landscape beyond, a slightly less freezing air was your sole hard-won victory indoors. The nights, however, truly unveiled winter's terrifying majesty. Darkness descended like a suffocating shroud, swallowing every familiar contour. The wind, a banshee's wail, shrieked through every imperfection, while the meager fire in the hearth puttered with a pathetic, valiant effort, offering its scant warmth mostly to the fortunate few whose toes danced closest to its flickering embrace. For those exiled to the room's periphery, the biting cold was a constant, unwelcome companion, making their indoor existence barely distinguishable from a poorly provisioned camping trip. Clothing offered little sanctuary. Peasants were strangers to the plush luxury of fur coats or the cloud-like comfort of goose down. Instead, their wardrobe comprised a few coarse woolen tunics, perhaps a cloak exuding a suspicious goatish aroma, and the desperate hope that a multitude of layers might somehow transform them into an impermeable human onion. Alas, this was a fantasy quickly dispelled. And the notion of snuggling under soft, plump quilts? Pure fantasy. Beds were often little more than crude sacks overflowing with prickly hay or straw, occasionally augmented with old rushes for an extra layer, and as an unwelcome bonus, a thriving community of fleas to provide additional company. Oh, medieval peasant life, a true paragon of luxury! The cold, a silent, pervasive predator, transcended mere discomfort. It was a mortal threat. Frostbite, hypothermia, and the stark reality of freezing to death were ever-present specters, particularly for the most vulnerable, infants and the aged. Each new dawn that found you still drawing breath was a minor miracle, a small triumph, honestly worthy of celebration, perhaps with a breakfast of a slightly less frozen turnip. Indeed, surviving a medieval winter was an exercise not in comfort, but in raw fortitude. It demanded gritted teeth, every scrap of clothing piled high, communal huddling with cherished livestock, and fervent prayers that you wouldn't awaken adorned with icicles hanging from your brows. And this, my friends, was merely the overture to their true adventure.
For those lamenting a drafty modern apartment, consider the medieval peasant whose dwellings weren't merely drafty, but functioned as zealous wind tunnels, albeit with a roof. Most peasant homes were what historians, with a touch of academic politeness, refer to as Wattle and Daub constructions. In plainer terms, a giant, intricate basket of crisscrossed sticks, lovingly smeared with a charming admixture of mud, straw, and, yes, animal dung. This wasn't a question of aesthetics. Dung was a readily available, cheap, and surprisingly sticky insulator. These walls, no matter how assiduously applied, stood little chance against the wrath of a full-blown winter storm. The biting wind sought out every hairline crack, every minute gap, gleefully pirouetting its way into these single-room abodes, swirling malevolently, ensuring no soul grew too complacent. Privacy, an utterly alien concept. Warmth, a fleeting illusion. Character building, undeniably. And then the roofs. Quaint, picturesque thatch, to be sure, but after months of relentless rain and snow, these protective layers inevitably sagged, leaked, and occasionally offered a convenient entry point for local wildlife. Nothing quite completes a pleasant evening like a squirrel plummeting onto your dinner. Windows, if such luxuries existed, were laughably minuscule, typically covered by thin animal hides or simple wooden shutters. Glass, a material of exorbitant cost, was beyond the means even of the lord of the manor, who might possess a single precious pane. Peasants, in their pragmatism, considered themselves fortunate if the blustery winds of a blizzard didn't rip the entire cowhide shutter clean off the wall. Adding to this catalogue of discomfort, floors were often nothing more than compacted earth. Heavy rains or deep snows often resulted in mud seeping upwards, transforming interior spaces into impromptu, if unappreciated, indoor water features. In winter, every step within one's own home could feel like a slog across a frozen marsh. Cold assailed from below, from above, from within, a relentless three-dimensional assault on precious body heat. But the medieval peasant, a creature of fierce resilience, harbored no time for whining. They expertly plugged gaps with moss, jammed old rags into the most insistent drafts, and huddled together, forming living, breathing human insulation. Creativity, obstinacy, and a liberal application of sheep grease to the walls were often the last bastions against becoming medieval popsicles. For when your very dwelling threatened to disintegrate and your best defense against the elements involved mud and goat hair, laughter, albeit of the chattering teeth variety, was a small, defiant luxury. As if the freezing air from all sides weren't enough, medieval peasants faced a more insidious foe, the frozen ground itself, a silent enemy rising from below. Floors, as we conceive them today, were largely absent. Instead, one found merely a slightly flattened patch of earth inside the dwelling. With exceptional luck, a scattering of straw or old rushes might offer a brief, tantalizing illusion of comfort. But make no mistake, you were perpetually a single, uninsulated back's breadth away from the mercilessly cold, hard soil. And oh, that cold possessed a relentless malevolence, seeping up from the earth like a ghostly evil worm, winding its way through straw, into bone, and finally, into the very soul. To drop an item onto the floor on a winter night was to condemn it to the permafrost, forever enshrined. Peasants devised various strategies to combat this grim subterranean battle. One approach involved laying thick mats of straw across the floor, a luxury if one could afford it, or more plausibly, if one could pilfer enough from a neighbor's field without detection. This might provide a decent insulating barrier, yet straw compressed quickly, molded even faster, and added a perpetually crunchy soundtrack to already miserable nights. Other homes opted for dried rushes spread liberally over the dirt. The common practice involved periodically scattering fresh rushes atop the old, accumulating a fascinating, multi-layered ecosystem of decaying plant matter, fleas, and any number of mysterious creatures that chose to take up residence. This was, in essence, medieval carpet padding, albeit one that was alive, slightly damp, and perpetually redolent of wet dog. Beds, for the fortunate few who possessed them, offered little respite. Typically, they were rudimentary wooden frames filled with, predictably, more straw or hay. Far from the embracing softness of modern mattresses, these layers were poking, shifting, and crunchy, offering scant defense against the frigid emissions from below. Tossing and turning became not an act of seeking comfort, but a desperate, awkward dance to maintain circulation and avert the partial freezing of one's anatomy. The truth, stark and unyielding, was that medieval peasants never truly vanquished the icy ground. They merely learned to exist, uncomfortably, above it. A truly restful night was not about dreams or softness, it was about awakening with all 10 toes still firmly attached. A triumph that, if achieved, placed you well ahead of most.
If any element in a medieval home could lay claim to heroism during winter, it was neither the roof, nor the walls, nor even the valiant layers of dirt and dung, but the hearth. This crackling, obstinate fire pit served as the singular, unwavering bulwark against the invading cold, the suffocating darkness, and the pervasive gloom of medieval life. At the very core of almost every peasant dwelling burned a simple fire. Forget elaborate fireplaces with sculpted stone mantels or neatly constructed chimneys spiriting smoke skyward. Instead, one found a rudimentary pit or a modest pile of stones, perpetually adorned with half-consumed logs and emitting enough smoke into the room to provoke serious consideration of whether one was slowly undergoing a culinary transformation into ham. Indeed, most homes entirely lacked chimneys. Smoke, left to its own devices, simply did its best, eddying out through tiny roof apertures, through wall cracks, or, on particularly uncooperative evenings, directly into one's lungs. While certainly not conducive to respiratory health or longevity, it proved remarkably effective at fumigating fleas and other unwelcome denizens, who, after all, needed pest control when immersed in a perpetual marinade of smoke. The hearth transcended its role as a mere heat source. It functioned as the kitchen, the sole beacon of light, and at times the medieval equivalent of a television. Families congregated around its glow, spinning tales, exchanging gossip, or simply gazing into the mesmerizing flames, for after sundown, diversions were few. Sustaining the fire was not mere a preference, but an absolute imperative. To permit the fire to perish overnight was tantamount to hoisting a banner, inviting the cold to enter and claim its final victory. Furthermore, reigniting a winter fire was a monumental undertaking, far removed from the modern convenience of a match. It demanded flint, steel, painstakingly gathered kindling, and a greater quota of desperate prayers than one might offer in a lifetime. Every member of the household bore a crucial duty, stoking the embers, monitoring the fragile glow, adding peat, sticks, or, on truly fortunate occasions, a precious piece of dry timber. It was a ceaseless war between human perseverance and the suffocating cold, which yearned for nothing less than to extinguish every spark of life. The hearth, while offering no guarantee of survival, rendered survival utterly impossible without it. A smoky, sputtering, often disappointing little flame, yet in the grip of a medieval winter, it was the undeniable, beating heart of hope itself. Among the myriad anxieties that plagued medieval peasants, the prospect of their precious fire dying out overnight loomed larger, perhaps, than even the depletion of the ale barrel. For without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would infiltrate with a predatory swiftness,
quicker than a tax collector after a bountiful harvest. And in the oppressive depths of winter, rekindling a fire from cold ashes was no mere inconvenience. It carried the stark potential of death. Matches were a distant future, lighters an unimaginable dream. To restart a fire meant the laborious striking of flint against steel, a fervent prayer for a solitary precious spark, followed by the meticulous coddling of that spark with tender care and any dry kindling not already consumed days prior. Imagine this arduous ritual performed in the freezing darkness, half asleep, fingers numbed by the cold, with the added motivation of a hungry wolf's distant howl. But medieval peasants were not without their cunning. They banked the fire, not in a cozy financial institution, but by carefully entombing glowing embers beneath a mound of ash before retiring for the night. This ash acted as a natural blanket, insulating the precious coals and sustaining their fragile life until morning. Executed correctly, one could approach at sunrise, gently prod the pile, introduce fresh wood, and voila! Fire sans the peril of frostbite. A misstep, however, ensured mornings were significantly colder and undeniably grumpier. Firebanking was a closely guarded art passed down with the reverence of a prized family recipe from parent to child. Each family boasted its own arcane secrets. Some advocated dry ash only, others swore by a touch of dampness. Some packed the embers tightly, others preferred a looser breath. One could easily ignite a spirited medieval debate merely by suggesting an alternative firebanking technique, the ancient equivalent of arguing over barbecue methods, albeit with considerably higher stakes for survival. Occasionally, even the most meticulous firebanking proved insufficient. A cunning gust of wind might exploit a hidden crack and extinguish the embers regardless, or a clumsy sheep might inadvertently stumble into the hearth, a known occurrence. Hence, some families implemented nocturnal ember checks, taking turns to rise in the frigid darkness, essentially the medieval precursor to sleepwalking to adjust the thermostat. Ultimately, firebanking was less about absolute mastery over nature and more about purchasing a few additional precious hours of warmth. To awaken to the sight of even a single surviving ember was a hard-won victory, enough to fuel another day's relentless battle against the cold. In the brutal calculus of medieval winters, the adage, "the more the merrier," transcended mere celebratory sentiment. It transformed into a primal survival tactic. When the hearth fire flickered in protest and the icy winds howled through every crevice, the most reliable source of heat was profoundly simple: each other. And if this necessitated sleeping in intimate proximity with one's entire family, immediate neighbors, cherished livestock, and possibly a thoroughly bewildered goose, then so be it. The concepts of personal space and privacy evaporated entirely. On the most frigid nights, comfort was not the objective. Merely avoiding the fate of awakening frozen to the floor was the ultimate goal. Entire households converged into the warmest corner of the dwelling, swaddled in every available scrap of cloth, coalescing into what could best be described as a desperate, snoring human lasagna. Younger children nestled snugly between parents, grandparents sought refuge beneath the outer layers, and should a surprise visit from Cousin Ethel occur, room was invariably found for one more. Fortunate indeed was the individual who secured a central position, bathed in the radiating body heat from all sides. Less fortunate were those relegated to the edges, experiencing the medieval equivalent of sleeping beside a meat locker door. And woe betide the restless sleeper who shifted too much. One single quest for comfort might accidentally dislodge on Adra into a freezing draft by the wall, instantly crowning you the family villain.
Bedding, too, was often a shared commodity, a vast communal straw mattress, gradually flattened under the nightly weight of multiple generations. And given that standards of hygiene were not exactly garnering accolades, one can safely assume these sleeping arrangements were not the most fragrant. Yet when pitted against the grim alternative of frostbite, fastidiousness quickly became a forgotten luxury. Body heat was not merely a pleasant bonus, it was a calculated strategy. Certain medieval guides even advocated for the deliberate positioning of the strongest and warmest individuals on the periphery of the group, forming living shields against the penetrating cold. Infants and frail elders, deemed precious little heat generators, were carefully tucked deep within the central core. This practice, however, transcended mere survival. Over time, it became an intrinsic aspect of daily life, fostering an undeniable sense of family bonding. Long winter nights spent huddled together inevitably gave rise to storytelling, murmured songs, and undoubtedly some truly fascinating conversations muffled beneath a shared woolen blanket. So the next time a sibling pilfers your blanket, or your beloved pet commandeers the bed, remember, at least you're not contending for elbow room between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat. If the notion of modern roommates presents a challenge, allow medieval peasants to introduce you to their winter housemates: cows, goats, pigs, chickens, essentially any creature possessing a pulse and a modicum of body heat. The practice of bringing livestock indoors was far from a quaint village eccentricity. It was an utterly vital stratagem for survival. Animals were living, breathing warmth generators, and in a poorly insulated hovel where the wind's howl often eclipsed the rumble of one's own stomach, every fraction of a degree was precious. Furthermore, a goat sharing your living space was marginally less likely to be pilfered by a hungry neighbor under the cloak of night. Two birds, one profoundly odorous stone. As night descended, the house transformed into a chaotic living furnace. Chickens found roosting spots in corners. Pigs snorted contentedly near the hearth, and cows, with an air of bovine entitlement, lounged luxuriously against the walls, chewing cud as if contributing rent. It was decidedly unglamorous. Indeed, it was the antithesis of glamour. If one has ever endured a summer road trip with an unhygienic companion, imagine that, but on a grander four-legged scale, during winter with literally nowhere else to retreat. The olfactory experience? Legendary. By springtime, the accumulated perfume of a shared winter was undeniably formidable. There was no need to light scented candles. One's nostrils were already on a wild, involuntary sensory journey. Yet medieval peasants cultivated a highly selective sense of smell, complaining little, for they understood an uncomfortable yet undeniable truth. The more animals within, the fewer frozen toes at dawn. Certain species even commanded prime locations. Cows, owing to their sheer size and prodigious warmth, generally occupied center stage, often in close proximity to the human family. Goats, being goats, were granted a similar privilege for their warmth and the inevitable fact that they would find a way inside regardless. Chickens contentedly roosted in rafters or abandoned baskets, while pigs, utterly devoid of social graces, simply plopped down wherever they pleased, often right in the middle of the floor, demanding reverence. Of course, sharing one's sleeping quarters with livestock was not without its particular hazards. Imagine the rude awakening, drifting peacefully into slumber, only to find a chicken has chosen your hair as a convenient perch, or upon first light stepping barefoot into something undeniably suspicious. Medieval mornings were indeed replete with such delightful surprises. Still, despite the cacophony, the pervasive aromas, and the occasional unexpected hoof to the ribs, peasants grasped the fundamental life-saving arithmetic. Cold kills, and cows, whether they desired to or not, provided warmth. In the ceaseless battle against winter's icy embrace, the warm, slightly slobbery breath of a cow often tipped the delicate balance between life and death. In the stark realities of medieval winters, fashion was not an aesthetic pursuit, it was a desperate strategy for survival. Peasants harbored no aspirations of following the latest trends. They layered clothing with the solemn intensity of soldiers preparing for a confrontation with the grim reaper himself. The governing principle was elegantly simple. If you owned it, you wore it, often simultaneously. The foundation was the basic undertunic, a scratchy, likely never quite clean linen garment. Over this, a thicker woolen tunic, then another if fortune permitted.
Leggings, perpetually sagging at the knees, were added, followed by a rough cloak draped over the shoulders, and for the truly blessed, a patched sheepskin worn with the pride of a hard-won trophy. Congratulations! You are now approximately 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots were an unattainable luxury for most. Many wrapped their feet in multiple layers of cloth or worn rags, then crammed them into crude wooden clogs. If the cold still pierced through, one simply added another rag and offered silent prayers against the loss of a toe. And the notion of laundering these multitudinous layers? An impossibility. Washing clothes in the depths of winter entailed a perilous trek to a frozen stream, the arduous task of smashing through ice, and then an agonizing 2-day wait for one's sole shirt to dry, assuming it simply didn't freeze into a tragically stiff, unwearable husk. Most peasants with pragmatic wisdom concluded that smelling like a melange of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a minor sacrifice when weighed against the alternative of freezing solid.
Intriguingly, the cumulative buildup of dirt and grease offered an unexpected boon: insulation. This organic, grimy layer proved remarkably effective at trapping precious body heat, functioning as a kind of medieval Gore-Tex jacket, albeit significantly more fragrant and, by contemporary standards, far less socially acceptable. Hats, scarves, and gloves were objects of immense value, treasured beyond measure. A simple woolen cap could delineate the line between enduring the night and awakening with one's hair literally frozen to the wall. Gloves, often crudely fashioned from whatever scraps of leather or fabric could be scavenged, frequently resembled mournful puppet costumes rather than articles of fashion. Children, in particular, were swaddled until they approximated overstuffed turnips, waddling awkwardly about the dwelling. The overriding objective was to meticulously trap every possible molecule of precious body heat. Style, elegance, these were unheard of concepts. Warmth was the true medieval display of power and success. So the next time a chilly day prompts a grumble about layering, spare a moment to remember the medieval peasant who routinely navigated their world wearing half their entire wardrobe, resembling lumpy laundry bags, and considered themselves immeasurably fortunate for the privilege. In the meticulously crafted playbook of the medieval peasant, dirt transcended its mere definition as something to be scoured away. It was, in essence, a foundational survival tool. As it turns out, cultivating a state of grimy existence was not a surrender to despair, but a calculated, tactical, dare we even say, genius maneuver. Winter, you see, presented a particularly acute problem: heat loss. Clean garments, especially freshly laundered linen, were surprisingly dreadful at retaining warmth. Their inherent breathability, while desirable in milder climes, became a significant liability when the ambient air temperature hovered precariously between the onset of hypothermia and instant, profound regret. This is precisely where dirt entered the equation. As peasants toiled through the ceaseless days without the luxury of washing their attire, successive layers of grime, the body's natural oils, and good old-fashioned mud inexorably began to accumulate upon their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this burgeoning natural armor effectively occluded the minute interstitial gaps within the fabric, rendering their clothing considerably more wind-resistant. It was, effectively, medieval weatherproofing, albeit an iteration that was notably more aromatic. Granted, one might exude the distinct aroma of a goat that had regrettably lost a wager, but crucially, one remained warm. Indeed, some medieval folk held the conviction that frequent winter bathing could actively induce illness. Far better, then, to meticulously preserve that protective, hallowed barrier of filth. Bathing was a rare indulgence, laundry an even rarer event, and soap, when it did occasionally manifest, was strictly reserved for occasions of significant import, such as the arrival of a bishop or perhaps, with a touch of fatalism, just prior to one's demise.
Adding another layer to this ingenious strategy, peasants would simply layer new garments atop existing ones without bothering to remove the underlying already worn attire. Consequently, one might gradually evolve into a living, walking museum of the past 6 weeks' sartorial history. Each accumulated stain a silent testament to some heroic incident. That one time I slipped in the mud, but miraculously did not perish. To an external observer, medieval peasants might have appeared, and indeed smelled, as though they had utterly abandoned all pretense of hygiene. Yet the peasants themselves understood a deeper truth. That grimy, crusty tunic was not a mark of squalor, but a vital thermal shield against the encroaching specter of death by frostbite. It lacked glamour, certainly, but then so did freezing to death merely for the sake of smelling like wildflowers. Moreover, in a world where virtually everyone contributed to a pervasive olfactory tapestry, one was hardly causing offense. Nose blindness was, in effect, a fundamental mode of existence. Therefore, in the crucible of medieval winters, filth was not a failure. It was fashion. It was function. And to possess a thick, greasy outer layer by the arrival of February was, my friend, to be unequivocally winning at the precarious game of life.
If the very thought of medieval peasants nestled amidst plush feather beds adorned with richly embroidered quilts ever crossed your mind, then prepare for a stark reevaluation. The reality was profoundly more rustic, and by rustic, I mean a pragmatic decision to sleep upon a haphazard pile of desiccated plant matter, clinging to a fervent hope for the best. Beds, in the austere world of the medieval peasant, typically consisted of a rough wooden frame, if one could even afford such a luxury, upon which rested a voluminous sack crammed full of straw, hay, or aged rushes. That, unequivocally, was the extent of it. There was no memory foam to embrace the contours of the body, no orthopedic support to soothe weary backs, no semblance of a five-star hotel experience. What one received instead was a perpetually crunchy, irregularly lumpy, and intermittently pokey assemblage that exuded a faint, unmistakable aroma of the barnyard and a profound sense of regret. Each restless turn in the night was accompanied by the delightful soundtrack of rustling straw, often punctuated by the occasional sharp jab from a recalcitrant stalk. Some peasants, in their extreme pragmatism or poverty, even dispensed with the wooden frame altogether, simply scattering the straw directly onto the dirt floor, thereby creating a luxurious ground-level sleeping experience that modern wellness influencers would undoubtedly rebrand as earth-connected slumber. These straw mattresses, however, were not merely uncomfortable, they were inherently temporary. With the passage of time, the straw inevitably flattened, succumbed to mold, became a magnet for various insects, and generally devolved into a biological hazard zone. The changing of the straw constituted a significant event, typically undertaken a few times a year for the diligent, or more frequently, whenever the bed commenced exhibiting autonomous movement without explicit permission. Rushes presented a popular alternative. These long grasses were spread generously across the floor, occasionally intermingled with aromatic herbs such as lavender or rosemary, primarily to attempt to mask the pervasive, overwhelming scent of livestock and the daily realities of medieval existence. While fresh rushes offered a brief, lovely fragrance for perhaps a day, they quickly assimilated into the muddy, trampled landscape of the interior, merging seamlessly with dirt, discarded food scraps, and whatever other detritus happened to wander in. And of course, one must not overlook the ever-present bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and a charming assortment of other small critters relished the straw bedding almost as fervently as the peasants themselves. If one awakened scratching more than one had actually slept, congratulations, you were authentically immersed in the medieval experience. Despite these formidable hardships, these humble beds were undeniable lifesavers.
The accumulated piles of straw furnished a crucial insulating layer against the pervasive cold radiating from the frozen earth. Furthermore, the act of clumping together atop them created precious pockets of shared body heat, medieval central heating at its rudimentary finest. So, the next time you luxuriate in the embrace of your soft, supportive mattress, pause and remember that somewhere a medieval peasant from history observes, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth and muttering, "Must be nice."
When your very dwelling is a precarious assembly of sticks, mud, and sheer optimism, the realization dawns swiftly that winter breezes are not merely a minor inconvenience, they are aggressive personal assaults. Medieval peasants therefore waged a relentless war against the cold, not only from the hostile outside, but from within the very confines of their homes, armed with nothing more than whatever paltry materials they could force into the innumerable cracks that riddled their abodes. And rest assured, cracks were legion. Walls warped, the daubed mud crumbled, and the thatched roof sagged under the weight of moisture. The cold, a malevolent entity, seemed to possess a preternatural ability to discover novel points of ingress each night, like a mischievous poltergeist harboring a personal vendetta. The painstaking art of sealing up the house became a paramount seasonal endeavor. Peasants meticulously stuffed every gap with moss, dried straw, precious scraps of old cloth, tightly bound bundles of dry grass, and, in desperate instances, even animal hair. If it was remotely soft, pliable, or possessed even the vaguest insulating quality, it was rigorously jammed into a hole somewhere. Some individuals, driven by an almost superhuman resolve, undertook the annual winter project of daubing additional layers of mud and dung over the exterior of their walls. Imagine standing in the teeth of freezing weather, methodically slapping cold manure onto your own home, all the while muttering a mantra of self-delusion, "This is perfectly fine. This is pure luxury." Because, in a grim practical sense, it truly was. Roof leaks represented another constant battlefield. Thatch, while an abundant and inexpensive material, was hardly renowned for its waterproof qualities, particularly after enduring several seasons of rain and snow. Peasants would ingeniously plug holes in the roof with spare fragments of cloth, tightly bound bundles of reeds, or, in moments of extreme desperation, with chunks of turf illicitly appropriated from the nearest field. In time, every dwelling assumed the appearance of a slightly melancholic patchwork quilt hastily assembled by an artisan who had lost heart halfway through the task. Doors and windows, if they were present at all, were rudimentary affairs, often little more than crude wooden planks suspended by iron nails and sheer stubborn willpower. Window openings were routinely covered with animal hides or thick cloth saturated in animal fat, not only to obstruct the most insistent drafts, but also to imbue the living space with a bonus aroma of mysterious, slightly rancid meat. Each night was a relentless duel between the boundless resourcefulness of humanity and the insidious, omnipresent cold. One moment a fragile warmth, the next a sudden gust would exploit the single missed crevice, jolting one awake like the icy caress of doom. Yet somehow, through a potent blend of shrewdness, indomitable stubbornness, and an absolute refusal to accept slightly frozen as a permanent state of being, medieval peasants meticulously patched, stuffed, and muddied their way through the most savage winters nature could unleash, one crude, muddy handful at a time.
When the cold intensified its bite, becoming so piercing that it robbed slumber from even the most exhausted, medieval peasants forged a brilliant solution. Forget the unrealistic notion of everyone enjoying uninterrupted rest. Instead, they pioneered a survival strategy that, even today, would command the respect of any seasoned military commander: sleeping in meticulously orchestrated shifts. This was no grand formal system complete with bugle calls and roll-taking. It was far more organic, born of desperation. Roughly half the household remained awake, engaged in the ceaseless task of tending the life-giving fire and diligently plugging any fresh drafts, while the other half curled tightly under threadbare blankets and hay, striving to snatch a few precious hours of half-frozen slumber.
The fire, that fickle heart of the home, demanded constant vigilance. Left unattended, its embers would inevitably dwindle, and restarting it, as we know, was an undertaking akin to persuading a stubborn donkey to perform a jig. Thus, an ember patrol was essential, and since no soul, once having achieved a fragile state of warmth, desired to stir, families implemented a rotating shift system. One might doze for a few fleeting hours, then be rudely roused by an elbow, before stumbling stiff-limbed towards the hearth to poke, prod, and perhaps utter a few choice curses at the recalcitrant flames, all while gingerly avoiding stepping on a sleeping goat. The night watch was anything but glamorous. There were no night vision goggles, no whispered late-night snacks, and certainly no 5 more minutes snooze buttons. Only stiff joints, eyelids heavy with exhaustion, and a steadily burgeoning resentment directed squarely at whoever possessed the loudest snore during one's own shift. Children old enough to competently wield a stick were swiftly pressed into service, learning early on that in winter, every individual contributed their weight or faced the consequence of freezing in the attempt. Grandparents, often possessing a lifetime of hard-won experience and frankly suffering from arthritis that made lying down and rising again a monumental ordeal, often maintained longer vigil by the fire. And when one's coveted turn to sleep finally arrived, peace was a rare commodity, disrupted by the restless movements of family members, the rustling of animals, the relentless battering of wind against the fragile walls, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who had, in their own easy slumber, rolled over too forcefully. Achieving anything resembling quality rest was, in itself, a small miracle. Yet, despite the pervasive exhaustion, the system functioned. Sleeping in shifts ensured that a pair of cold, begrudging eyes and hands was always ready to keep the hearth alive. The embers survived, and by extension, so did the family. So, the next time you grumble about rising to adjust a modern thermostat or to let out a pampered cat, spare a contemplative thought for the medieval peasant squinting into a smoking, dying fire at 3 a.m., pondering the true importance of his toes. Indeed, when the cold reaches a profound intensity, one must consciously adjust even the most fundamental act of survival: breathing. Medieval peasants didn't merely combat the frigid air with layers of cloaks, roaring fires, and ingenious communal sleeping arrangements. They subtly altered the very mechanics of inhalation and exhalation to navigate the treacherous nights. The core problem was brutally simple. Deep, open-mouthed breaths drew icy air directly into the delicate lungs. In a world where pneumonia could claim a life with a swiftness that outpaced the utterance of a Hail Mary, this was a risk no one dared to entertain. Consequently, peasants cultivated the sophisticated art of what might be termed survival breathing. Eschewing the huge, gulping intakes of air typical of someone who had just completed a marathon, they adopted a shallow, deliberate, and crucially, nasal breathing pattern. The underlying principle was to gently pre-warm the incoming air, however minimally, before it reached the vulnerable pulmonary system. It was an imperfect solution, but demonstrably superior to coughing oneself into an early grave by February. An accidental, large mouthful of cold air was met with immediate dread, guaranteeing a week of hacking up what felt like fragments of one's very soul, with no physician in sight and only grandmother's hot onion tea and stern prayers for remedy. Some individuals even resorted to tucking portions of their cloaks, shawls, or available rags up over their faces as they slept, fashioning a rudimentary yet effective breath-warming barrier. Of course, this ingenious solution inevitably resulted in awakening with a damp, slightly soggy fabric patch clinging to one's mouth. Yet this was a small inconvenience compared to the terrifying prospect of freezing from the inside out.
Children were rigorously indoctrinated into these vital techniques from an early age. Parents would sharply reprimand little ones caught panting like overheated dogs indoors during the frigid months. And frankly, navigating the strictures of breathing lessons, the constant itch of woolen layers, and sharing a sleeping space with an aggressively gassy goat meant that medieval childhood winters were a character-building experience of an entirely different, profoundly challenging magnitude. At the height of night, nestled deep within straw bedding, beneath an accumulation of cloaks and adjacent to a gently steaming cow, breathing ascended to an art form. It was slow, steady, exclusively nasal, and as minimal as humanly possible, resembling some grim medieval interpretation of a yoga retreat, albeit one featuring considerably more frostbite and a notable dearth of inspirational quotes. In the comprehensive survival playbook, this strategy lacked ostentation, yet it undeniably worked. One shallow, deliberate breath at a time, peasants persisted through another interminable night in the long, unyielding war against winter.
In the relentless, uncompromising struggle against the medieval winter, peasants unearthed an unexpected yet profoundly effective secret weapon: a well-filled stomach. It emerged that one of the most potent defenses against the encroaching cold was not merely another scratchy wool tunic, but the strategic act of gorging oneself on a hearty, substantial meal just before retiring for the night. The fundamental principle was simple: calories translated directly into warmth. The more matter the body had to diligently digest, the more metabolic heat it generated in the arduous process. This was, in essence, rudimentary medieval thermodynamics. Consume a heavy meal, trigger an internal furnace, and perhaps, just perhaps, you might endure until morning without transforming into a peasant-shaped popsicle. So what gastronomic delights did medieval peasants heap onto their crude plates before a long, freezing night? Picture thick, robust stews, heavily laden with earthy root vegetables, turnips, onions, parsnips. Grains, too, were vital lifelines. Bowls of oat porridge, coarse barley gruel, or dense, chewy rye bread. Should one be particularly fortunate, perhaps after a rare festival or a propitious animal slaughter, a precious hunk of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage might even grace the pot. This was not comfort food in the contemporary Instagram-worthy sense. There was no delicate presentation, no artisanal garnishes. This was a singular, enormous, vaguely brown repast, meticulously engineered to settle in the gut like a benevolent brick, slowly combusting through the night, providing just that crucial increment of warmth. The strategy transcended mere gluttony. It was about intelligent consumption. Foods that demanded prolonged digestion released a slow, steady, precious trickle of warmth. Fatty foods in particular were extolled, not solely for their immediate energy yield, but because fats metabolized far slower than lean meats. A belly replete with stew, bread, and a questionable quantity of lard constituted the apex of medieval winter luxury. Parents, driven by the harsh realities of survival, ensured even the most finicky children ate heartily. No one indulged little Thomas's dislike of turnips. One consumed the turnips, or one shivered through the night, haunted by the ghost of missed turnip warmth. Harsh, yes, but undeniably effective parenting, medieval style. Of course, this practice of heavy nighttime eating carried its own particular hazards. While undeniably warmer, one also risked a night of profoundly vivid, often bizarre dreams, fueled by a stomach valiantly attempting to process the caloric equivalent of an entire field of cabbages. Was it worth the peculiar nightmares? Absolutely, because ultimately, peasants harbored no aspirations for Michelin stars. Their singular ambition was survival. And if that meant retiring to bed full, bloated, and breathing gently through one's nose beside a gently steaming cow, well, that was simply another night's skirmish in the ongoing, relentless quest to witness another frosty sunrise.
Long before the advent of electric blankets and the luxurious embrace of heated mattress pads, medieval peasants were compelled to exercise remarkable ingenuity to conjure a modicum of extra warmth at bedtime. And it was through this necessity that the unassuming hay box and the deceptively simple, yet utterly glamorous, heated stone ascended to the status of winter's unsung heroes. Let us begin with the hay box. Its name evokes rustic simplicity, and indeed it was, yet its underlying principle was pure genius. Peasants would procure a sturdy wooden box, meticulously line it with a thick layer of hay, and then utilize it to store food that had been cooked earlier in the day, thereby keeping it remarkably warm for hours. Leftover stew, hot porridge, these provisions could be transferred to the hay box, tightly covered, and would retain sufficient heat for a late-night snack, obviating the perilous necessity of rekindling the fire. Essentially, medieval slow cookers. But the peasants' resourcefulness extended beyond mere food preservation. They recognized that if hay possessed the capacity to trap the heat emanating from a stew pot, it could undoubtedly trap the heat from an even more efficacious source, rocks. And thus, the era of the heated stone dawned. Before retreating for the night, one individual, likely whichever unfortunate child had lost the day's family argument, would select a suitably flat stone and consign it to the fierce heart of the hearth fire. After roasting it until it was almost too scorching to touch, a precarious calibration between beneficial warmth and third-degree immolation, the stone would be carefully extracted using a stick or rudimentary tongs. This stone, still radiating a blissful, potent warmth, would then be meticulously wrapped in rags, tucked securely into an old piece of cloth, or crammed into a clay pot, and finally slipped either beneath the hay in the mattress or positioned strategically at the foot of the bed. Behold, a medieval heating pad ready to wage war against the frozen earth below. Naturally, this ingenious solution was not without its inherent hazards. An improperly wrapped stone, for instance, could lead to the rather unfortunate consequence of a small, localized house fire. And to drop such a heated projectile onto one's bare foot, well, let us simply observe that winter injuries were not exclusively confined to mishaps on ice. Yet when every step of the process aligned perfectly, that unassuming stone provided a precious, profound comfort, radiating warmth for hours on end. It was not a luxury in the modern sense, but when one's abode was a half-frozen hut, true luxury was defined as the ability to awaken without icicles adorning one's nose. In the grand arsenal of medieval winter survival, a hot rock nestled in some hay might sound unglamorous, but for peasants desperately clinging to every available spark of heat, it was nothing short of a tiny miracle. Within the humble confines of a medieval peasant's home, the hearth was far more than a mere cooking surface. It was practically an animate member of the family, a temperamental, perpetually smoky, and occasionally uncooperative family member to be sure, but nonetheless absolutely indispensable for survival, particularly when the time came for sleep. Proximity to the fire directly correlated with one's chances of awakening unfrozen. This imperative dictated that sleeping arrangements were less about individual preference and more about strategic positioning. Infants, the elderly, and any individual afflicted by illness or frailty received first dibs on the prime real estate closest to the flames. Parents, older children, and more robust adults radiated outwards from this central warmth, forming successive layers of human insulation. Assigning a spot near the fire was not simply an act of kindness, it was a fundamental equation of survival. Babies, after all, were fragile heat generators, and elders were invaluable repositories of familial knowledge, and, let's be candid, the richest sources of village gossip. Protecting these vulnerable members with the warmest positions was absolutely non-negotiable,
Yet the arrangement was not without its delicate balance. Too close, and one risked the unfortunate outcome of singed hair or a cloak suspiciously smoldering. Too distant, and one might as well have been attempting to sleep in an icebox. It was a finely choreographed dance. Remain close enough to luxuriate in the fire's radiant glow, but not so close as to necessitate an awkward explanation to a neighbor regarding one's newly acquired resemblance to a half-roasted joint. Moreover, the fire's warmth did not distribute itself with democratic fairness. It tended to intensely roast those directly in its visual path, while everyone else jockeyed for position within the narrow, coveted cone of heat, much like cold lizards vying for a sunbeam. Fortunate indeed was the individual who managed to drift into slumber facing the fire, experiencing the blissful warmth on one side of their body, while the other remained so solidly frozen that it could, hypothetically, be tapped upon. Pets and livestock, of course, were not to be outdone, muscling their way in to the coveted warmth. A dog might audaciously wedge itself between a human and the fire, its tail wagging with a perilous proximity to the open flames. Chickens, with remarkable nonchalance, sometimes perched precariously upon the hearthstones, clucking softly into the night like diminutive, feathery guardians of warmth. Every crackle of the logs, every subtle shift of the glowing embers was a tiny, whispered promise. You're still alive. You're still warm for now. And so peasants drifted into an uneasy, fitful sleep, lulled by the fire's gentle pops and hisses, each exhaled breath forming ephemeral clouds in the frigid air beyond the fragile circle of light. It was imperfect, it was uncomfortable, but it was life, tenuously clinging to warmth by a single flickering thread of glowing coals.
In the unyielding world of medieval winter, solitude was a luxury only afforded to those who courted the fate of becoming a meticulously sculpted, albeit frozen, statue by January. Survival was not merely a familial affair. It was an immersive, collective village project, a messy, muddy, and often boisterous collaboration where the warmth and very lives of each individual were inextricably linked to those of their neighbors. The peasants understood with absolute clarity that in the frigid depths of winter, a robust fire and a generous pile of hay possessed finite capabilities. If the light in a neighbor's dwelling abruptly vanished, it was noticed. If the telltale plume of smoke from old Tom's hearth ceased its characteristic curl towards the sky, someone invariably went to investigate. And this was not solely due to Tom's outstanding debt of a chicken, though that might indeed factor into the urgency, but because the very essence of community was intertwined with the imperative of survival. Villages cultivated informal winter watchers, often the young or the elderly, whose physical limitations precluded field labor, but whose keen eyes could monitor who developed a persistent cough, who had failed to appear for bartering at the market for several days, or whose home appeared ominously still in the morning frost. These individuals were the medieval precursors to a neighborhood patrol, albeit one notably devoid of reflective vests and significantly more integrated with the local sheep population. Should a family's fire unexpectedly extinguish, it constituted a near catastrophic emergency. A good neighbor would hasten over, bearing a glowing coal carefully bundled in rags, or, in an even more profound act of generosity, extend an invitation for the beleaguered family to squeeze into their own smoky, already overcrowded hut for the night. Yes, this meant accommodating an additional 4 bodies within an already cramped space, yet it was undeniably preferable to the grim discovery of frozen friends come springtime. Communal food stores, too, assumed a critical role. During winters of exceptional brutality,
Villages sometimes pooled their dwindling reserves of salted meat, grain, and dried vegetables. It was a grim form of charity, as no one possessed much surplus, but a few shared meager meals could often represent the critical difference between staggering into spring or perishing before its arrival. Even children grasped the gravity of the stakes. They assisted in delivering precious wood, shared glowing embers, and ran urgent messages when a neighbor required assistance. No one was deemed too small or too weary when winter's merciless grip tightened. Certainly, medieval villages were not idyllic havens of perpetual sunshine and harmonious fellowship. Feuds were commonplace, disputes over parcels of land, errant goats, or the borrowing of a favored cooking pot never truly dissipated. Yet when the nights descended into lethal cold, old grudges were frequently, if quietly, set aside. For the survival of a rival was still deemed valuable, given the chilling possibility that tomorrow it might be oneself in need of rescue. In the icy heart of winter, the village coalesced into one vast, stubborn family. Occasionally dysfunctional, often unexpectedly humorous, but always fiercely determined to collectively endure. One muddy boot, one flickering ember, one frozen smile at a time.
When medieval peasants confronted winter's merciless cold, their arsenal extended far beyond the mere piling on of cloaks or the diligent stoking of the hearth. They engaged in fervent prayer and copious amounts of it. For when the wind wailed like predatory wolves outside the paper-thin walls of their dwellings, and the fire dwindled into a melancholic cluster of sullen embers, every conceivable advantage was sought, including the profound comfort and hope of divine intervention. Faith, in that era, was not merely a Sunday observance. It was an intricate, indispensable thread woven into the very fabric of every freezing breath. Before seeking an uneasy slumber beneath layers of scratchy straw and coarse wool, families would collectively kneel, offering hurried, heartfelt prayers for the fire to persist, for the fragile roof to remain intact, and for their precious toes to remain attached by morning. Saints transcended their roles as distant, hallowed figures. They became the frontline defense against winter's onslaught. Saint Blaise, for instance, was frequently invoked for protection against throat ailments, a far from minor concern when a single inhalation of icy air could precipitate a cough so severe as to feel like expelling one's very soul. St. Nicholas was not yet solely the jovial gift-giver of later lore. He was also earnestly petitioned to safeguard households from sudden ruin during the lean, deadly months. Superstitions intertwined themselves snugly around the daily realities of survival. Some families would sprinkle a small measure of holy water near the hearth before sleep, hoping it would ward off malevolent spirits or, at the very least, mischievous drafts. Others would mark doorways with blessed chalk after specific feast days, a silent plea for warmth and good fortune to find its way within. Candles, too, played a significant role. Special vigil candles, frequently blessed by the local priest or the most devout old woman in the village, were occasionally kept burning throughout the entire night, a fragile, flickering supplication against the cold darkness that clawed relentlessly at the walls. And of course, no earnest winter prayer session was complete without a few hastily uttered promises. "Dear Lord, if you simply grant us passage through this night, I swear I shall be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who perpetually absconds with our turnips." Faith, in this context, was not an abstract solace. It was a daily, urgent, and deeply personal conversation. The peasants did not petition for luxury. They pleaded for survival. A modicum of warmth, a morsel of food, and one more day to simply muddle through until the spring finally broke winter's frozen grip on their tiny, struggling villages. It was a simple, raw hope, whispered into the smoky rafters, inextricably tangled in breathless prayers, and tucked beneath itchy blankets, a hope that somehow, impossibly, carried them through the endless, merciless nights of winter. Despite the remarkable ingenuity, the fervent prayers, and the sheer, unyielding stubbornness medieval peasants deployed against winter, the chilling truth remained: sometimes it simply wasn't enough.
And when winter asserted its dominion, it did not merely claim a few unfortunate souls, it swept away entire families, whole villages, consigning them to a silent disappearance beneath a heavy, unforgiving shroud of snow and ice. Certain winters etched themselves into memory with particular cruelty, such as the infamous Great Famine Winter of 1315. During this cataclysm, incessant rains destroyed precious crops, livestock succumbed to starvation, and plummeting temperatures transformed an already brutal existence into a slow, agonizing disaster. Accounts from that desperate period whisper of people resorting to consuming shoe leather, tree bark, and in the most horrifying instances, one another. The failure to maintain the hearth fire was not a mere inconvenience. It was, more often than not, an unequivocal death sentence. Without the hearth's meager warmth, families would huddle together for what would prove to be their final embrace. Neighbors, in the grim thaw of spring, would sometimes discover entire households, their bodies still locked in a frozen embrace, as if desperately attempting to share just a little more heat until the very end. The very structures of their homes were vulnerable, capable of collapsing under the crushing weight of heavy snowfalls or the relentless battering of ice storms. A roof caving in during the dead of a frozen night was not merely catastrophic, it was, frequently, fatal. The arduous journey through thigh-deep snow to beg shelter from neighbors offered no guarantee of salvation either, particularly if those neighbors were already stretched to their own breaking point of survival. Disease, too, found a willing accomplice in the cold. Starvation invariably weakened the body, rendering it susceptible, while cramped, smoke-filled homes transformed into fertile breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and a host of other deadly infections. A seemingly innocuous cough in December could all too easily presage a funeral by January. And then there was the quiet, insidious horror of frostbite. Fingers, toes, and even ears would blacken and die, often remaining chillingly attached to their owners. Some villagers, those surviving the winter, did so at the profound cost of their limbs, a grim, painful badge of honor that silently proclaimed, "I endured, but winter exacted its price, taking a piece of me." Yet what remains most haunting is not merely the sheer scale of death, but the eerie normalcy with which it was accepted. People understood with a stoic resignation that each winter would claim some among them. Death was not an unexpected visitor. It was simply another neighbor at the door, cloaked in frost, patiently awaiting its turn. Even amidst the bitter cold and the omnipresent threat, medieval peasants pressed on, stubborn, grieving, yet fiercely clinging to life, for as long as a single ember glowed in the hearth, as long as one faint breath misted in the frozen air, there remained a fight worth fighting. As we cast our gaze back upon these medieval peasants, those muddy, frost-bitten survivors of an endless succession of winters, it is tempting to focus solely on their hardships. The cracked, raw hands, the painfully frozen toes, the smoke-choked confines of their huts. But beneath the surface of that relentless struggle lies something far more potent, more enduring. It is a legacy of raw, indomitable ingenuity and an unbreakable spirit of endurance. They possessed no central heating systems, no sophisticated thermal jackets, no plush, body-contouring memory foam mattresses. They did not even have the comforting luxury of assuming they would survive until spring. But what they did possess, and what they bequeathed to us, was an invaluable blueprint for resilience. Every hay-stuffed mattress, every meticulously banked fire, every crevice in a mud-crammed wall artfully plugged with moss, each was a profound testament to human creativity blossoming under extreme pressure. Confronted with seemingly insurmountable odds, they did not succumb to despair. Instead, they adapted. They learned with an intimate wisdom from the very land beneath their feet, from the collective experience of one another, and from the brutal, unsparing lessons carved by each successive, unforgiving winter. Their communities were not merely founded upon shared territory, they were meticulously constructed upon the bedrock of shared survival. They taught each other to vigilantly watch over the sick, to pool their meager resources when food supplies dwindled, and to cultivate an implicit trust that an active aid extended to a freezing neighbor today might, just might, be reciprocated tomorrow. They lived by the profound understanding that no one, truly, could defeat winter alone. Their faith, too, was a potent form of endurance. They meticulously wove prayers into the very fabric of their daily lives, not solely out of fear, but out of a fragile yet fiercely tenacious hope. Hope that tomorrow might dawn a little warmer, a little brighter. Hope that after 100 dark, desolate nights, spring would inevitably return, and life, in its mysterious persistence, would find a way to push through the frozen ground. And miraculously, it did. It was because of their sacrifices, because of their unglamorous, incremental victories, surviving just one more night, one more storm, that future generations were able to thrive. Bit by frozen bit, they painstakingly nudged humanity forward, enduring winters that their ancestors could barely conceive of surviving, until warmth and comfort transcended mere distant dreams to become common, expected realities. Their blood, their sweat, and their boundless ingenuity are invisibly yet indelibly stitched into the very fabric of the lives we inhabit today. Every soft, cozy blanket, every meticulously heated home, every languid winter evening spent sipping warm tea under the gentle glow of soft lights, all of it represents the ultimate culmination of countless medieval peasants who steadfastly refused to capitulate to the cold. So, the next time the wind howls a mournful dirge outside your double-paned window, perhaps spare a quiet thought for them, the nameless, fearless ones who transmuted the raw, shivering act of survival into a living, enduring legacy. One ember, one breath, one stubborn, courageous heartbeat at a time.